Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren, and I'm the programs coordinator for the Brown County Historical Society. And here at the Brown County Historical Society, we work to collect, preserve, and disseminate the history and heritage of the Brown County area. Thank you to everyone for coming out today, and a big thank you to our volunteers. Programs like this are made possible by the help of our members. And if you would like further information regarding becoming a member, we have brochures over at our front table. Now, the Brown County Historical Society would like to welcome Ted Marti, who is a fifth-generation descendant of August Schell. And
Okay, can everybody hear? Yep. Okay, so hopefully I don't repeat what I talked about last time, because I don't remember it anyway, so hopefully you don't either. So, but I did I wanted to concentrate a little more about the lead up to Prohibition as opposed to what happened during Prohibition. It was just as important in the lead up, and so you'll find out a little bit about it now. So anyway, Prohibition was the culmination of over 100 years of an effort to reform and end the evils of alcohol. The concern of alcohol abuse began long before the 18th Amendment was passed. As early as the mid-1700s, alcohol abuse was a big concern. During the early 1800s, men drank almost exclusively in taverns, serving primarily whiskey, rum, and gin. It was a little more difficult to make beer than those. You could do that in the heat. So in order to make beer, you had to do it up in the cooler countries, and we didn't have a lot of good brewmasters back then. So anyway, owners and patrons regularly ignored the governing laws of operation and serving minors, and drunkenness became a serious social problem. Even medical doctors weighed in on the effects of drinking, calling spirits anti-federal. This behavior became the beginning of the temperance movement. So, in 1826, the American Society of Temperance was formed. Noticeably absent from these early efforts to promote temperance was beer and wine. Whiskey was the bad guy, you know. Early on, beer and wine were praised as temperance drinks, owing in part to the lower alcohol content. As a result of these ongoing temperance efforts, hard liquor consumption decreased by nearly one-half between 1820 and 1850. They drank a lot of alcohol back then. So, on the other hand, beer drinking increased sharply after 1850 as many lager breweries sprung up. And this was due in part to the great influx of Germans. By the middle of 1800s, many states had passed liquor laws already, regulating public drinking and adding heavy license fees for taverns and liquor outlets. Between 1851 and 1855, 13 states had banned hard liquor by then. In 1863, only 5 remained, due in part of the Civil War. The Union instituted a national liquor tax of $1 to help fund the war effort. The important source of revenue helped to quell the zeal of the temperance advocates. The temperance movement, however, had broad support from the middle class, especially from the Northeast and the South, Methodists and Presbyterians. The urban poor and immigrants that came in during that time, as well as the wealthy, paid little attention to the movement. And this is especially true for the flood of Germans and Irish immigrants coming in the 1850s. They brought with them a strong tradition of drinking in taverns, beer gardens, and on Sundays, to the dismay of the religious folks there. So there was, interesting was, when you had these big slums in the big cities and all the immigrants coming, the water supply was actually very poor, and so you had to drink beer. So, anyway. Hooray for poor sanitation, you know. So the temperance supporters continued to push for political and legislative power. So they showed how wives and children and families were directly tied to their cause. Aid the family in its struggle with the saloon, they hollered, by highlighting the damages to the family, naming domestic violence, children beating, abandoned to poverty, wives being beaten. The movement continued to gain momentum. In 1869, the National Prohibition Party was formed with a platform of destroying the saloons and achieving women's suffrage and securing voting rights for black Americans. So as the power grew in the temperance movement, they brought in these other issues as a way to further their cause. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed under the banner of home protection. In 1880 to 1890, the second great prohibition wave began. The result was 6 states had enacted prohibition laws going dry in 1890. During these years, breweries owned and had a controlling interest in almost 80% of the saloons. They would establish local district offices and would make loans at easy terms for licenses, fixtures, and stock. The saloon, in turn, was encouraged to sell as much of the product as they could. These were the years of the free lunch. And the free lunch was a way to get customers into the door. And obviously, they had a free lunch, and then they drank, and they drank, and they drank. And many times they walked out the door, and the paycheck they came in with was gone. And this was really sort of the last straw for the beer side of the alcohol. So, despite the efforts of the German breweries, what one do I have here now? Oh, I'm one ahead there. So, despite the efforts of the primarily German brewers to portray beer as a national solution to the drinking crisis, beer and hard liquor were now tied together in the eyes of the temperance movement. In spite of the setback, brewers continued to promote beer as a healthy drink for the whole family. So, oh, now I'm way ahead. All right. In 1905, the Anti-Saloon League became the dominant force of prohibition. Over the 19th century, the call for temperance gradually changed to full prohibition of all alcoholic beverage. Under the direction of Wayne Wheeler, the Anti-Saloon League was very effective in getting support across the political spectrum. Through propaganda, religion, and political coercion, the Anti-Saloon League successfully made alcohol the crucial issue in all elections. In 1906, 3 states were dry. In 1913, 9 states were dry. By 1916, well before Prohibition, 23 states were dry. So many of these states sometimes would bounce back and forth. They're wet for a while, then they went dry, and so forth. So it was hard to kind of get a real gauge on what was happening. With the U.S. entrance into World War I in 1917, breweries and beer were accused of being supportive of Germany and therefore anti-American. So because of all the German breweries, most of the breweries in the United States at the time were run by German descent. And in fact, August Busch was a close friend of the Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. So you can imagine what Budweiser took as against the war. Beer was targeted as making Americans weak, and one more reason to include beer in Prohibition. In August of 1917, in response to the entrance in World War I, Congress passes the Lever Food and Fuel Act. as a way to conserve grain for the war effort, this act prohibited the use of grain in the production of hard liquor, but not beer or wine, which, by the way, were considered foods. Yummy, a sandwich in every bottle, you know? This temporarily put a halt to distilling, and they limited the beer to 2.75% alcohol by volume. Most beers today, and even back then, were about 4.5%, so almost half the alcohol that they reduced it to. The temperance movement was thrilled at what they got, but disappointed that it didn't include beer and wine. So just a half a year later, the 18th Amendment was introduced and sent to the states to ratify. And it took about another year before it was finally put into law. So Minnesota was not immune to the events of the rest of the country. Minnesota's first temperance society began in 1848, 10 years before the state was founded. The movement towards prohibition continued in spite of the strong German and Irish population. So they were a little upset there that they were doing that. By the end of 1915 in Minnesota, 56 of 87 Minnesota counties voted to go dry. This represented 47% of the state's population. So already in 1915, it was tough on breweries trying to maintain their production. So we'll see a little bit later about what we did. At Schell's, we felt the impact of the Prohibition movement early on. In an article about Schell's on September 5th of 1908, Otto Schell comments on the impending possibility of prohibition. And there, you can't read that article, so I'll read it. It behooves thinking people to look into the cause of these spasmodic efforts and to find the reason of their ordinary short lives and failures. Men's desire for convivial amusement, I don't even know what that word is. Recreation and stimulants is as old as the history of mankind. People crave relaxation from labor and seek enjoyment. There can be no question but that these desires are inborn and inherent part of human nature. The majority of civilized people use predominantly the lighter alcoholic drinks in a moderate way and advantageously for restoration of their bodies, the enlivening of their mind, the promotion of social ability, and as a remedy against many of these ills that flesh is heir to. Look at that. When you drink beer, you get all of that for free. Dr. Wiley, the United States expert on pure foods, writes, beer is a veritable food product. The eminent scientist Pasteur earnestly advocates that the regular use of beer in moderation. If a man does not care to drink, that is his own concern. If it's not of his concern, but it's none of his concern if a fellow man does not care to abstain. The growing generation ought to confine themselves to a moderate indulgence of the lighter alcoholic beverages. We will find in the end that a prohibition party will have spent its energy and will die out, while the brewing companies will manufacture a pure, health-giving drink for those who care for it. Not even the teetotaler can eliminate alcohol from his food. It contains either alcohol directly of materials which generate alcohol during the process of digestion. I didn't know that. Total abstinence does not exist on earth. It would certainly mean starvation. So, group thing for beer. So, hold on. So, like most breweries, we had ownership and control of a lot of saloons. We also had warehouses and ice houses out to support the network of agencies working to support our sales. Back then, we had a lot of agents, and there was in different towns. And they essentially were the salesmen in that area. And so we had properties that they used and worked out of, and they sold ice and so forth. We would make loans, like I said earlier, to operators of the saloon in exchange for exclusivity or preferential treatment. So the loans would cover the liquor license, furniture, bar fixtures. So, and then here's the list of just some of the bars that we had and the names and where they were located and the amount we would borrow to them. So, out of curiosity, I tried to calculate the value of a $500 license fee in today's dollars, and that would be like $16,000 that you would have to pay. So I called the Rick at the B&L and see how much he paid. Well, he pays about $33,000. So back then, they were paying that much money, and it took a lot of kegs to cover that cost. And I tried to figure out and I couldn't figure out if we had 6-ounce glasses back then. I didn't know, or 8-ounce glasses. But at a nickel a glass, it maybe took you selling 100 kegs just to cover the license fee. So it was tough. They tried to limit alcohol by higher fees. In January 1909, Otto told the board of directors that license fees were getting very hard to collect or even uncollectible. The old minutes didn't reflect if the loans made were collected or ever forgiven. So already by then we're feeling the effects of pre-prohibition. So, yeah. You've maybe seen this one in the museum. So by then many towns in our territory had voted to go dry. One of those towns was Redwood Falls, and they voted to go dry in 1910 by 6 votes, a margin of 6 votes. 1911, the margin was 16 votes to stay dry. Then in 1912, the vote was dead even. So they tossed cards to see if they would go wet or dry, and they voted to go wet. So this picture, I'm puzzled at this picture because it's in April of 1912, and they're dumping beer, and I don't know if it was old beer that they had in there for years and years when they were dry, or it was a picture from earlier. So someday I'll find out. So with the reality of more and more dry communities and the strong resolve that beer had enduring health qualities, Schell's began to produce a lineup of new products. As early as 1906, we produced and marketed different beers highlighting their wholesome qualities. Up to that point, we had just basically one beer, Schell's Export. And then we had a couple of offshoots. We made a Bock beer, we made a Münchner beer, and a Pilsner. So in response to the positioning beers as healthful, brewers began to produce malt tonics. And I'll read that too, because that's pretty interesting. Malt tonics supply the needed help. It is a highly concentrated liquid food made from Eastern barley malt, Bohemian hops, California honey, and double distilled potable water. It is rich in the elements that feed the tissues, restore nerves, health, and make rich red blood. For indigestion, nervousness, insomnia, expectant motherhood, convalescence, old age, anemia, dysplasia, brain fag, must be fog, but they were putting A in there. And to keep feeling good at all times, of course, nothing is better. The best druggists sell it. If yours doesn't, send us his name and we'll see that you are supplied. This was an ad for Brewery. I think they were in Missouri or something on select malt. That's why they had that song, right? Beer is really good for you, whatever. I can't sing. Well, we have a Concord singer in here, don't we? So, so in response to that, we began making a malt tonic. And this is one of the early, I think it was a test batch of the recipe for the malt tonic. So, and it's hard to read too, so it's just to show you that I'm telling the truth. Maybe. Anyway, so so they were, like I said, marketed as healthful and medicinal. And we and other brewers touted the many advantages of the tonic. They were brewed much like regular beers with malt and hops, and sometimes juniper berries or other ingredients. They contained as much, if not more, alcohol as our regular beer. Again, isn't marketing great? Good for you. In 1906, so we started brewing our tonic, Schell's vacuum tonic. And this was fermented in our Fodler vacuum tanks, giving us a point of difference from other tonics in the market. These Fodler tanks, and we have a picture of it in the museum, but they had flanged sections, and they were steel tanks with glass lining. And so you could pull a vacuum on there and you wouldn't crunch the tank. So, and that allowed us to speed up the fermentation process. We would add air in the bottom of the tank and activate the yeast faster, and then we'd draw the air and the carbon dioxide off the top with the vacuum. So this allowed us actually to help make more beer in a shorter time. So vacuum tonic, which had a healthy amount of alcohol, was touted as, this is all on the label, good for nursing mothers, a tonic for the sick and convalescent, anchor of perfect health, which, by the way, we trademarked. Take a glass with meals and on retiring, a healthy beverage for table use, and finally, non-intoxicating. So, and here's a couple postcards, obviously the nursing mother, and then the kid at the dinner table eating, or kids I guess they are, having a glass of vacuum tonic. So, cereal extract. This was introduced about the same time as vacuum tonic. Both had the nurse wrapped around holding the bottle, using the phrase anchor of perfect health. Also recommending that you take it with a meal or retiring. It also, and then you can see on there it says fermented liquor, which is puzzling, I guess. And I have no idea why they did that, unless it was that they used maybe more corn than barley in the recipe, so maybe it felt more like a liquor recipe. So, you know, in the run-up to World War I, barley supplies were limited, and that may have forced the brewery to use more corn. Or, and this is probably true, it was something different to attract the new customer. Cereal obviously had a healthy connotation, and it says on there, good for the family, for you and the family. So, again, it's like Wheaties in the glass. So again, I'm unclear why they made cereal extract, because we were also producing Schell's export lager at the time. So the ingredients we purchased seemed to be the same, as well as the brewing process. The alcohol, however, was somewhat higher than export lagers. Again, it may have been a way to separate beer from liquor in the wake of the growing push for abolition of alcohol. Skip something. So, another beverage produced in 1910 was called Schell's carbonated mead. Now, mead would suggest a honey-based beverage, and our records show we purchased honey from during those years, so we may have used it in that beverage, but in others too. But and then I'm not sure when I can't find where we discontinued mead, but it wasn't too long before Prohibition and was gone. And our mead was it's advertised as, probably see it better on, you're all familiar with that, but absolutely free from alcohol. So to be absolutely free from alcohol, it couldn't have been a fermented beverage. So I'm guessing if we're using honey in that, it was probably a pretty rich, sweet beverage. So I'm not sure though. Another beverage, this is pre-Prohibition, appeared around 1909, and it was touted as a healthful, non-intoxicating beverage. And I couldn't find the recipe for this, but based on the name, I would guess it's a light in alcohol, and yet malty and sweet. Perhaps we added unfermented wort, and wort is actually the liquid we produce before the yeast is added and turns it into alcohol. Maybe some of you have been in the Caribbean. There's a drink called Malta. It's really unfermented. It's like drinking fresh wort. So some people like it, most people hate it. So this one also seemed to disappear in 1912. So kind of a flash in the pan. Now, it's interesting the use of non-intoxicating versus non-alcoholic. They're really very different. Non-alcoholic is less than 0.5% alcohol by volume. Non-intoxicating could be as high as 12% alcohol. So I think beer got a little luck in being able to produce a higher alcohol product and still be non-intoxicating. So by promoting your beer as non-intoxicating was really, I think, a reference to the healthful qualities of beer and really another separation from hard liquor. When beer returned after Prohibition, 3.2% was the unofficial standard for non-intoxicating. Just remember those early days at Heritage Fest when we were selling 3.2 beer out there? Non-intoxicating, right. There were a lot of bodies that staggered out of there. Not in a straight line either, so. So 1910, hard to see, but this is the poster much like the carbonated mead. It was a non-alcoholic malt, and it was produced at the same time as the carbonated mead. This was produced actually without a government mandate. It's 1910 already, and we're not sure. Was it an effort to reach the dry towns? I'm not sure. Unfortunately, by 1912, both light malto and NA were discontinued. So apparently they didn't hit the mark very well. So why did we produce non-alcoholic beers 10 years before Prohibition? I don't have a clear answer other than more and more of our selling territory was going dry. Why were they discontinued? Homebrew was popular, illegal liquor was popular, soft drinks, and this is a real big one. We're starting to grow, and then simply maybe the product was something people didn't want. So Prohibition was initially put in force, and we were allowed to brew beer and ferment it, and then we had to dealcoholize it. We had to reduce the alcohol to 0.5 of 1%. So it was possible, however, to make tonic beers and sell them through pharmacies. So the prescription to purchase it had to come from a doctor and be for a legitimate ailment. So Most commonly, though, whiskey was prescribed, and you could get 1 pint of whiskey every 10 days. And technically, the pharmacist had to cancel your prescription, and you had to get a new one. And so, but by so you could have bought tonic through the same channels. But by 1921, the government excluded beer from being prescribed. But anyway, needless to say, the pharmacists and doctors did very well in those years, selling medicinal whiskey. So, I know we made a tonic in 1920, but I don't know how much it went to the pharmacies. I just can't find anything on that. And we did have a recipe for non-alcoholic tonic, but I don't know whether we ever made that either. But that involved actually heating the tonic in those vacuum tanks that we had. And we would only have to heat it to 127 degrees. And if you put a vacuum on it, it would essentially cause the alcohol to boil off. So, and then they would finish it in the kettle, boiling it. So, oops, too fast. Thanks. Okay. So these are some of our Prohibition labels. I just wanted to comment on. The earliest labels were Deer Brand Beverage and Sarah. And Deer Brand Beverage would have been basically our pre-Prohibition Deer Brand, only de-alkalized. And again, the process was to put it in the kettle, boil it and boil it, keep adding water to maintain the volume. And then we would add fresh hops and fresh wort and some sugar to lightly ferment it and recarbonate the beverage. So now you'll notice on all the Prohibition labels, there's no word called beer on there. The words beer and near beer on the label were outlawed by the Volstead Act, the Prohibition Act. So none of those have beer on them. So Sarah was another early beverage we had, and we can actually tell the dates of the labels. You can't see it, but about midway through Prohibition, they required you to put a L permit. I'm not sure what the L stands for, but the L permit on the label. And the two that don't have it on are Sarah and Deer Brand. So Sarah was another beverage brewed early in Prohibition. I'm assuming that Sarah was a reference to cereal extract that we produced in earlier years. And then, of course, on the label, absolutely pure and wholesome. 1922, we began producing root beer, which sold very well at times. We almost sold as much root beer as beer in those early years of Prohibition. A board minute comment states that root beer costs less to make than Sarah, and we could sell it for more than Sarah. Later on, then we came with a cola too. So those were the only two soft drinks that we made. So this is a unique one. During the same time we introduced a root beer, same time we introduced root beer, we also had a beverage called Uno. And very little was written about Uno other than just a copy of. I want to read you a letter. So, there's a copy of a letter from Ernie Hagberg, who was the son-in-law of George Marti, and Walter Schell, who was the son of Otto Schell. He was living in California. And so he writes, we have a permit from the government to manufacture real beer, but not sell it. When the real beer is properly aged and fermented, it's pumped back into the kettle and boiled until it contains less than 1/2 of 1%. This is what we call Uno. When labeled, it's Deer brand. And there are several customers that think it's real beer. We're charging $3.60 a case, where we can only get $2 and less for Sarah. And I don't know what some graft means. I'm still puzzled. I've never seen a UNO label. I don't know if we had very few references in the inventory to UNO, but I think what they did is simply put the UNO, and I'm not sure what that means, UNO. On the neck label and the body label, it said Schell's Deer brand beverage. So as Prohibition deepened, business became tougher and tougher, and we did a series of those other different near beers that came after Sarah, and I can't imagine that any of those were a different beer other than a label change. Soft drinks and illegal booze were taking a toll. The stock market crashed. The depression didn't help. And out of 1,300 breweries in the United States prior to Prohibition, we managed to hang on as one of the only 71 surviving breweries that did. Many breweries shut down or changed to making something other than beer. And when they tried to reopen at the end of Prohibition, it took them a long time. And so ultimately we got back up to 750 breweries. So anyway, at last, so Prohibition finally ends. So what were the effects of Prohibition on our brewery and the country? The first one was the end of the tied house. So breweries could no longer, or liquor companies could no longer own taverns and essentially tie up that business. Was number two, an unwanted creation of organized crime. That's pretty obvious. It brought about the creation of the wholesale network. Remember, we had agents out there, agencies in different territories. With the end of Prohibition, they wanted to put a separation between the brewery and the saloon, so the breweries could influence the saloon. So they created a wholesale network of separate independent businessmen that simply wholesaled your beer. And in the beginning, we had lots of one brand wholesalers. So he was a Schell's wholesaler. This guy's a Houndstein's wholesaler, a Schmidt, and a Grain Belt. And when you had one brand, you worked it really pretty hard. Then gradually, some got bigger, bought out the little guys, and pretty soon we're down to, in some cases, 2 wholesalers in an area. You got the Bud franchise wholesalers and the Miller. So, and obviously, when you have a situation like that, you don't get 100% of their time. So that was tough. So we created a consumer base that drank soft drinks and cocktails. So we had stricter regulations by the national state government, and they often conflict with the state government, national government regulations often conflict with the state government. So, and that's been a challenge sometimes. They limited free goods to bars and liquor stores for obviously reasons. We do have a limit of $100 a year in Minnesota. We created a permanent trend to home consumption that meant more bottles and cans. This ultimately, I believe, gave a greater advantage to the larger breweries because they can buy cans, they can buy bottles, much cheaper quantities than we can. And so prior to Prohibition, 85% of beer was sold in kegs, taverns. During Prohibition, it flipped to 80% was sold in bottles and cans. And right now, roughly we sell 90% of beer in bottles and cans, only 10% in kegs. Last was the tremendous loss of breweries. Those numbers, we never got back to those numbers until the 1990s. So Prohibition was tough. So that's all I got. Thank you. Any questions?
I don't know if you've looked through this. Was there a decrease in sales because of the influenza epidemic in 1918?
You know, I looked at some of the volume, and we had it from like 13 up to 1919. And the volume didn't change much up until 1918. Now, whether that, you said 1918, so it's possible. I'm not sure why the drop started so early, and then it went to less than half in 1919. So it was like right around 17,500 barrels up until 1918, and it went to about 10,000 barrels, and then it went to 6,000 barrels in Prohibition. So, yes.
I have two comments.
Yep.
In defense of women,
Yes.
who are supposedly the ones that were against alcohol. When they were voting, women couldn't vote.
Right.
So it wasn't the women that were voting.
You're right.
And the other comment is that I was a nursing mother in the 60s and 70s, and we were always told to drink wine and beer.
There you go.
And so it wasn't just back in those days.
Yeah. So, I know my mother drank beer all the time. I turned out all right. Yes.
To add on to what Mary said, because women didn't have equal rights, they didn't have any control of the family's finances, and if the men drank all their wages away because they owned the wages, then the women and children faced starvation. If they had had equal rights, then maybe Prohibition would have looked different.
Right. You're correct. Yeah.
Does the recipe for Schell's Cola still exist?
I do have a root beer recipe. I'm not sure I have a cola recipe. Basically, there's sugar in the flavor. Is what they are. So you can source the cola. So,
Was Volstead from Minnesota?
yes, he was from, what is it?
Granite Falls.
Granite Falls. Yeah. Yeah. You know, that Wayne Wheeler, the head of that anti-saloon league, I think basically wrote that Prohibition himself, and then Volstead kind of carried it through. So, yeah.
We have something we're living with yesterday. My uncle's name was listed as an early license holder, auto banker. He had his saloon at First North on Broadway, and at the beginning of the Prohibition, they tore his saloon down and built out of City Hall.
So who are we going to collect that old license loan bill from? The City Hall, maybe, huh? It goes with the property? No. Yes.
I remember being told that when you had your hair washed as a kid, you had a vinegar rinse, but then you had a beer rinse to give your hair a body.
Can we put that on the label, you think? Does it grow hair, too?
That sounds good.
Yes.
When Prohibition ended, and you probably were going to be swarmed with people that you now could get back into business, were there any steps taken to control the mobs, if you will? Were the people coming to the brewery?
The whole parking lot was full when they were there at midnight, because you could take the beer out at 12:01, and so. But I don't have a picture of that. I wish somebody would have taken a picture. We had beer in the tanks because we were making beer and de-alcoholizing it. So that was a big advantage for breweries that were in business. So they could go out and get secure accounts and so forth. So, yeah. Thanks. Yes.
Ted, the saloons that you owned during the Prohibition, how did they survive? And secondly, when was the last saloon that you owned?
I think maybe the last one might have been Cortland. But already during Prohibition, we were selling stuff off already. So we were selling properties. And then we still have some in Springfield. Searles was sold. Winthrop we had. So I suspect that we would have sold them and somebody might have started up a new tavern in there. So, yes.
No, the Prohibition almost put my mom's family out on the street. They were very successful saloon keepers, and of course that went away. So they really never recovered from that. And then as late as December of 1977, doctors were suggesting to breastfeeding women that they would be good for them to have beer every day, because that was the doctor told me.
I don't think they told you that, did they, Jody? Okay. Anything else?
Ted, my mother always said that when she was growing up, there was a beer wagon that would go around and deliver beer like a milk truck.
Yeah, we delivered beer.
You did?
Yep. We had, we serviced New Ulm. We ran out as far as, I think, like Fairfax. So in the early years, it was a beer wagon, literally a beer wagon. And I know they had some arrangements made with farmers with an extra team of horses. So when they got out to the bottom of the hill towards Fairfax, they'd switch horses so they could get up and go. So yeah, that was part of, most breweries, small breweries had a territory that they serviced. And then we would have shipped beer farther out to these agencies, and they would have either kept it in the ice houses or whatever, so.
This was more like door to door.
I know that was a real German tradition. I don't know, I've never seen anything that we did that, but we probably did, so.
You talked a little bit about certain things we put on your label as to what contents we good for. How did your marketing strategies or your budgeting for marketing change from pre-prohibition, during prohibition, and afterwards? How have things changed today?
Well, of course, back then you had newspapers, and we would run a little ad every once in a while in there. And then we had those posters. You saw on there the peacocks posters and the little signage. So most of the marketing was done with those kind of things in the taverns. So once it ended, then you started getting into more of the media stuff. You had radio and obviously television. So okay, well, thank you. Thanks for having me.